Hello, everybody. Darren Cross here, MBA 652 Organizational Behavior, and this is the lecture video for Chapter 7, which is one of the chapters inside of Mod 5. And what we're talking about here is decision making. So this chapter is about decision making and the process of creativity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So when we're talking about decision making, the purpose of making decisions is to select among options or choices so that we can solve a problem. So, from my perspective, the reality of problems creates the necessity of a decision. And so when we're in the organizational world, and especially if you're a manager, one of the things that we have to take into consideration all the time is that choices or decisions are necessary. And so we like to think, if you consider all of these things that we've been talking about along the way, this benevolent view that we have of ourselves and our ability to do things and, self-enhancement and confirmation bias and all of this kind of stuff, we kind of also assume that we make great decisions. And so when we're talking about a systematic way of making decisions, one of the things that is kind of an assumption or a point of view is that we think that we make rational choices, and that's where the rational choice paradigm comes in. So the rational choice paradigm maintains that we believe that we select or identify, select, and apply the best possible alternative to solve that problem. So there are a couple of components to this. One is called the subjective expected utility, SEU, and what we're trying to say is that we think, according to this view, we think that we do a really good job of looking at everything completely objectively and making a decision on the basis of that. But in reality, there are some things that come into play that kind of taint that process. Our subjectivity as humans, which we cannot avoid, comes into play as we're talking about this stuff. The other thing is there's actually a process of making decisions, and so we have to think about those. So what we're really saying here is, according to the rational choice decision, let me adjust this a little bit, decision-making process, there's a couple of ways. There's a like we said, one of the elements here is an actual process. So let's look at this. The first is identifying the problem or the opportunity for a decision, choosing the best process by which we're actually going to solve this problem, discovering or developing alternatives that could potentially solve that problem, selecting the choice with the highest value. And right here, this is where our subjectivity comes into play. A rational choice decision-making framework would suggest that, hey, we're making the rational choice. We'll look at all these assumptions as we go along, but we believe that we're looking at everything completely objectively, but the reality is, because we're people, there are things that come into play. We implement that choice, and then afterwards we determine how well that choice or decision actually solved our problem. So this is the process, okay? Now, the deal is, though, in that very first step, we have problems right off the bat with this process. And I think that you guys might be realizing this as I respond to some of your papers when you identify the problem. And we'll talk about I'll kind of use that as a reference as I talk about these things. So the deal is, or the thing that kind of puts a stick in this process is that there are problems with identifying what that problem actually is, right? So it's a challenge to solve the right problem. And there are all kinds of things that come into play, but the idea here is that this problem, for one reason or another, presents itself in a certain way, or maybe it doesn't, and we try to solve it, and there's some things that kind of get in the way. So let's talk about these 5 problem identification processes. The first one is stakeholder framing. The deal is, how do we even frame this question or this problem? Or, the idea here is that whoever's viewing this or perceiving this problem may perceive it as a problem, or it could be a solution, or some people could say that's horrible, it's worse than I thought. Some people think that it's not really that big of a problem. And so there are some nuances that go into that, as you'll learn as we go along here, but just right off the bat, how we frame the problem is not a linear, consistent fashion among people. And so it stands to reason that there, stakeholder framing is just like an opinion. Basically, everybody can look at it in a different way, and as a result of that, you may have some different solutions, and you may not be solving the problem, right? So if we're looking for a solution to the problem and we hand it to 10 people and they frame the problem differently and then propose solutions at the end of that, we may get, to a person evaluating this, we may get to the end of this whole process and realize, man, some of those actually solved the problem and some of them didn't, even though those people think that those problems were solved. Another thing is decisive leadership. There's this thing that we want to do. Research kind of suggests that people value decisive leadership, and so sometimes leaders, in our quest to be decisive, we decide that we're going to make a decision quickly, and so we don't give every problem due process, and we don't evaluate it clearly enough, and we don't really get down to the essence of what that really is about. And as a result of that, we may not have the best possible solution for that problem. We also sometimes tend to look at solution-focused problems. What are we really saying? We're saying, in the world of sales, we do this all the time, but what we're saying is we start with this thing that we kind of want to be implemented, and so before a problem naturally manifests itself, we are kind of looking for that thing, right? So if I am a painter and I have a painter perspective, then I'm going to notice every smudge on the wall, and it's going to look like a problem to me because I can paint things, and so I have the solution for that. And so sometimes we do that. The deal is, and we don't have the proper orientation when we're looking at a problem. And it might even be that we have the wrong view of it. Maybe that actually doesn't solve a problem that anyone cares about, right? And I think that we kind of ran into those things as we were identifying problems as well in your papers, because you can say something like, someone will say, well, there's low morale at this organization. And of course we know that we don't want low morale, but if you are a rational company and you are trying to, and part of your goal is to profit, morale, yes, low morale is an issue, but do we really care about it that much in the face of needing to make other decisions? Low morale in and of itself doesn't cause a problem unless it somehow bleeds into some kind of an organizational effectiveness issue, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at. It's just, when we talk about a solution-focused problem, it sets the orientation off a little bit before we even begin. Perceptual defense. This is kind of just being, insolent and thinking that we don't have a problem. So this is the boss who doesn't want to acknowledge that there's actually a problem. You're in denial. And so when you're always just kind of pushing things off and everything's benevolent, part of the deal with identifying a problem is that you don't even realize that there is a problem. Mental models. This kind of is related to solution-focused problems as well. What we're saying with mental models is we have this mental model of how things should be, and it may cause us a problem with identifying what may be wrong, or it might cause us a problem with identifying a good way to solve that problem. But, our mental models may be correct or they may be incorrect. And so what we do is we measure against that mental model, and that is our basis for determining if there's a problem. But perhaps that may or may not necessarily be true. But it definitely muddies the water when we're talking about how to identify what that problem actually is. So when we're thinking about the rational choice paradigm and we're thinking about how decisions actually are made, let's compare and contrast some of those things. So in a rational choice paradigm, let's look at some of these assumptions. First of all, we assume that goals are clear, compatible, and agreed upon. We assume that everything is the perfect condition for making this decision, right? So we know exactly what we want to do. We have all of the resources to do this, and everybody is on board for doing this. But in reality, goals are ambiguous. Goals are conflicting because when you have more people, you have people who have underlying goals to serve themselves, because each person is looking for that self-enhancement. And, usually you have to get everybody on board, and that can be a challenge. Another assumption is that people are able to calculate all alternatives and their outcomes. We are people. We're not computers. And so it's not always a linear and congruent picture of things, and so sometimes we're not able to look at things objectively all the time. I'll give you an example. So in the world of real estate, I think at least someone in one of these classes, one of these sections, is a real estate agent, or maybe an appraiser or something like that. But in the world of real estate, one of the things that we traditionally do is we do what's called a CMA, a comparative market analysis, and the purpose of that is basically to determine the value of a home. Okay, so it's really kind of cool. We have this system that helps us to determine. I'm saying like I'm a current realtor, but I'm not anymore. So we had this system. They still have it, where you take the home that you're trying to determine the value for, and you go into the system, which is a historical record of sales. It's the MLS that everyone uses, and you select homes that are very similar to that home. But in addition to that, you're looking for homes that have sold recently and that are close. So you have a couple of variables here. Number one, you have homes that are similar or different from that home. You have homes that are close or far from that home. And then you have homes that have sold either recently or not so recently. Okay, the best picture, the one that provides the best estimation of value, is a one that is, a home that is exactly like yours, that is very, very close to where your house is, and one that that sold very recently. So, if a house sold in the past week and it's exactly like yours, it's the same kind of house, a ranch with the same number of bedrooms, and it has, similar amenities and all of that stuff, and I don't know what I said. It sold recently, it's in your neighborhood, and it has similar functionalities and amenities. That's going to be a very good representation of the value of your home, because it's going to, what you're looking at is the likelihood that someone is going to choose someone else. So if that home is pretty similar, then it should sell for the same amount. The problem is, not all the time is the home exactly the same. So you could have like a 1,500 square foot house in the neighborhood that sold yesterday, but it is a split level instead of a ranch, or it has 1.5 bathrooms instead of 2. Or you could have a house that's exactly like yours, but it's 2 miles away instead of in your neighborhood. And that could, it's a home exactly like yours, but that neighborhood could be just a little bit different, and we don't understand it, what makes it different, but it sold recently. Or we could have a house that's perfect, that it's the house right next to yours, it's an exact model, everything is exactly the same, but it sold 1 year ago. This is where the person comes into play. You have to figure out, okay, do I want the house that sold longer ago? Do I want the house that's exactly like this? Do I want a house that just sold yesterday, same square footage, but is similar? Do I want a house that is, close in the neighborhood, but or maybe further away? This is where it comes into play. And so what happens is you kind of tainted the process, and that's what happens when we are making decisions here, right? We're not able to rationally understand with our minds what being, sold a year ago is going to do to the value versus being a closer house that may be similar but not exactly the same, right? So we're kind of just figuring that out on our own. And it's hard to know what that actually is. And so that's really what a real decision scenario looks like when you compare it to the perfect scenario, right? Another assumption is that people evaluate all alternatives at the same time. This is not true. We're presented with things and we look at things. Have you ever looked at something, you're presented with choices and you're like, well, I like that one. And then another choice comes up and you're like, oh, well, I like that one too. And another choice comes up and you like that one. And there are things that go on in your mind, these tricks that we play. We're not able to evaluate things objectively because we say, well, I like the first one. So you look at something and you're like, ooh, something's sticking in my head. Remember that the whole thing with primacy, right? It's the first thing we saw, and we got in our head that there's some things that we like about that decision. Or maybe recency is an issue. We like the last thing that we saw. So it just, the idea here is that it's hard to make a decision because we don't, we're not computers, and we have to think about how all of that stuff plays. More assumptions. People use absolute standards to evaluate alternatives. We're not stuck on things. We're not using calculations when we make decisions usually. Now, when you talk about decision support systems, that really helps, because what happens is you put all of these things into a support system, you hit a button, and it tells you what decision to make. And now you're like, I feel good about that. It's, seems like a fair way to go because the human part is taken out. But the truth is, people actually evaluate alternatives against a favorite that happened in their head. So, like before, if I liked the first one, then everything is based upon we're comparing it to the first one. And that kind of taints the process. We're saying it's not this thing that I really love. Well, is the thing that you really love the best possible solution for your problem? People make choices using factual information. Not all the time. Sometimes it's intuition, and sometimes, it goes through our perception process. And so not all the time are we making a decision that's factual. People choose the alternative with the highest payoff. No, that subjectivity comes through, and it's the highest perceived payoff. And a lot of time we satisfy, right? So we go for just solving the problem because somehow we've rationalized this inside of our head. Okay, so one of the things that taints this whole process, and when we're trying to look at all of the alternatives, we have these different heuristics or points of view or things that kind of, these are just perspectives on how we do things, right? So when we're talking about the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, we're anchored and don't move from usually an initial view of what we're trying to do, right? So we have this thing in mind. The book refers to it as the opening bid, and everything is based upon the relationship to that opening bid. How far am I from that opening bid? And that opening bid may or may not be objective. It could be completely subjective, but one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to say, well, I didn't want to get too far away from that in our minds. The availability heuristic. We estimate probabilities about how easily we can actually recall the information or the access that we think that we have something to it. So, sometimes we think that something's only accessible to us because we can remember it. And there might be some other things that we've completely forgotten about that could be potential solutions to our problem. And that's where creativity actually comes in. And we'll talk about that at the end of this chapter. The representativeness heuristic. We estimate the probability of something by its similarity to something known rather than by more precise statistics. So we'll say, for instance, if we're trying to solve a problem, we would say, it's kind of like saying, I know that duct tape would be the best for this scenario, but we'll use Scotch tape because it's similar, right? So we look at a solution and we say, well, this it's kind of framed the same way, so perhaps this, a different solution would solve the problem, but or a similar solution would solve that problem as well. And that may or may not be true, but the truth of the matter is we don't base it on the basis of anything factual or anything that can support it other than our suspicion that it might work. Now, we obviously, when we're trying to make a decision, what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize the value. So getting back into that, the whole problem with trying to figure out what's what, we're not able to determine usually what the best decision is because of all those things, like things come sequentially and not all at the same time. We are looking at things sequentially. We don't have the possibility to calculate everything all at once. We can only take pieces of information in a linear fashion. People lack motivation and ability to process that kind of information, right? So, if we're given a chunk of information, it's like, oh man, is there something that can solve this problem that's quicker? And that's usually what we do. Another thing to understand is that because of those motivations, we actually just kind of have this motivation to get to the end, right? And so we satisfy, our deal is we want to come up with something that solves that problem. And so we don't, if we can avoid it, we don't go through these exhaustive searches to find the absolute maximized decision. Our deal is, well, that actually solves the problem, so we're good to go. Or we don't have the capacity in our minds to actually figure out how to adequately and comprehensively solve this problem. We put false decision criteria on things, and as long as we meet those criteria, we think that we're solving the problem in the best possible fashion, but perhaps we didn't go deeply enough. And that's a problem with understanding how people behave in the face of trying to maximize something. Another thing that comes into play, emotions, obviously. I don't think that we need to dig deep into there. The problem is emotions taint the process. Emotions come into play, and it keeps us from actually making a rational decision. Intuition is the same thing. We go with gut feelings a lot, and sometimes it's a good deal, and you have to live with your gut all the time. But the problem is, when you're dealing with teams, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, that could come, a problem could arise, and we're not always making the best decisions. How can we choose better alternatives? Try to be as systematic as we can when we're evaluating alternatives. Think about our emotions and kind of check our emotions to make sure that they're not tainting the process. And do some scenario planning to plan out what would happen in various different scenarios, so that this is like game theory, right? So that you can figure out what possible outcomes would be with what possible combinations. And that kind of can give you a more complex view of things, which in reality is the best way to find a maximized decision. And perhaps you can even have a maximized solution. Now, some of the things that come into play when we're trying to evaluate our problems and solutions as well is confirmation bias, like we said, right? So we inflate the quality of the selected option because it confirms something that we already kind of wanted it to confirm. We also have this deal where we tend to want to escalate commitment or keep doing something that we're doing on the basis of just silliness, really. So it all is based upon our convincing ourselves that our decision is going to be the right decision to make, right? So, we justify ourselves. We are under this illusion that we want to continuously do something because of a sunk cost. We already spent the money, so we don't want to lose that money. Or the prospects theory comes into play, where we're trying to make a decision, and we decide that we're at the same time that we're looking at this, we're saying, well, this thing is something that I'm not willing to lose on, right? And so we have to hang on to this thing. And so we look at problems that do not cause us to lose something. So we're tainted by this view that losing something big is worse than actually making a wrong decision. And so that kind of taints us. And so for instance, we'll say, let's say we're going to make a decision, and we're deciding to get rid of a division. We might say, well, I'm not going to do that because this has been a part of us. I mean, we can't do that. We can't lose this division, whatever it might be. And so we keep going with it just because we can't lose something. We feel emotionally tied to that. So when we're talking about solving problems, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is this prospect of creativity. So, when we're trying to maximize stuff and we oversimplify things, the way to get around that is to think of creative possibilities that could possibly solve that problem. And so the creative process model comes into play, where we go into preparation mode by gathering all of the data and information that we need. We marinate on it and kind of let it do its thing. And then all of a sudden something happens, and we go into the mode of making sure that this spark of illumination that we have doesn't just end there, and that it actually makes sense and could be a long-sustaining solution to our problem. And so we want to actively engage that. And in order to do that, we need to have a creative environment and creative people. So let's look at the characteristics of creative people. This is kind of like looking at Mars again, right? This is the internal part of people. So creative people tend to have independent imagination. They tend to have cognitive and practical intelligence. They tend to know about the subject, or they have some experience in the subject, and also they persist. So the idea here is they're willing to stick it through in order to make sure that they can solve this problem. This is really kind of, they're internally motivated to solve that problem. Now, there are some things that come into play, right? When we're talking about independent imagination, some personality and emotional and perception issues might come into play. And it will with all of these things, actually. But just understand these are the characteristics of the person. But once you have a potentially creative person, we have to think about the actual environment itself. So a good creative work environment is a learning organization. So an organization that values learning, they have a learning orientation, which means they basically are, they're good with risk. They're okay with you making mistakes because they realize that those mistakes are going to turn into potential solutions or some learning or knowledge later on down the road. The work is intrinsically motivating. So depending upon, the nature of the task and the nature of how the managers interact with the employees, the people who are potentially creative are now motivated to move forward. There's open communication and sufficient resources, so you can't say, "Hey, I want you to, I want you to turn water into wine, and I don't know how you're going to do it." Right? You have to give enough resources if you're an organization. And the other thing is, teamwork might be able to help, and this says it's unclear how teamwork actually affects creativity. And I think there's some research coming out now saying that the diversity of thought that comes from teamwork actually feeds into creativity. But just the nature of competition and things like that could put some undue pressure on creativity. And also time might be a pressure on creativity as well. So we have to be aware of that. The problem is time is a limited resource, and businesses need to take advantage of limited resources, and so that's inherently what people are constantly looking and thinking about. So here's some creative activities that we can get into in order to kind of find better solutions to problems. Number one, redefine the problem. Break it down and see if there are other ways to look at the problem. Okay, so maybe you can look at abandoned projects to see if that was a different take on the same problem, and it might be able to inform you. Or you can just talk to other people who inherently have different points of view, and that's why diversity comes into play and helps you to solve that problem. How about associative play? This is where you kind of play and you engage differently, not for the purpose in and of itself of solving the problem, but just to kind of, this is a pattern interrupt. It's getting out of yourself so that you can look at it in a different way. Because we have these neural pathways that kind of lead us down the same way every time. And so this is a way of kind of snapping out of that so that we can kind of look at the problem in another way. And we can tell stories about it. We can do artistic activities. Morphological analysis. This is kind of like a Mr. Potato Head approach, right? So you have this inherent problem and you morph it in different ways to see if perhaps it sparks creativity. You put the shoe on the head, you put the nose, where the ear is supposed to be, and then it looks silly and it's enough of a pattern interrupt that you say, you know what, but maybe this could be a deal that just came to me. And so that could help too. Cross-pollination, diverse teams and information systems, getting out of your energy and into someone else's energy and allowing other people into your energy actually puts some ideas. And we see that kind of thing all the time where people never thought that this was something that would be a potential solution until someone came into their organization and introduced something. It's also important to understand that the level of employee involvement actually contributes to creativity and better decision making as well. And so there's different levels, low to high, and it's all about how much information they get, really, right? So a low involvement employee is one where they're asked information but they don't know what it's about, and you say, oh, okay, thanks for the information, and it helps you to solve a problem. Or you can hear the problem and then talk to someone individually and figure out what is your take on the problem. Or you can talk to a group of people and collectively see what their collective take is on the problem. Or you just give a problem to an employee and they have to actually solve the problem themselves. The employee involvement model. So the extent to which employees are involved, infused with the contingency of involvement itself, and then we'll talk about those in a little bit, lead to potential involvement outcomes. So identifying the problem better, coming up with better solutions, and actually being committed to that decision after you make a choice. So let's talk about some of those contingencies. Number one, decision structure. What is this problem? What's the framing of this problem? Is it a program decision? Is it a non-program decision? Is it a simple problem or is it a complex problem? So the nature of the decision itself is a contingency of involvement. Do I really need everybody to say something about this? The knowledge source. How much knowledge do I have and where is it coming from? Do the employees dig it on their own, or are they provided with a limited amount of knowledge just from the manager, or where does it really come from? The commitment. Is this a decision where people who aren't involved in it are not going to be committed to it? Because if that's the case, then you might want to pursue activities that actually help people to be committed to the solution of a problem. Risk of conflict within this decision. Does this kind of when we're looking at the conflict between team dynamics and organizational dynamics, is this something that is this one of those things that when you say, man, when I bring this up to the people, it's going to be a rough day? Or do you inherently think that people are going to be in agreement about that particular problem or a set of solutions? So all of these things come into play, and they all influence those potential outcomes. Okay? Now, everything beyond this, and this is available to you, but I just wanted to show you a couple of things that you can look at. This is the subjective expected utility slide. It kind of shows the best way that we can kind of make a decision. If we kind of weight some things and we look at valences and that kind of thing, but understand that those things actually are tainted by our subjectivity. And then there are some other things that you can look at that are just things to try to get you to think creatively. So that is the presentation for what chapter is this? Chapter 7. And I think that it'll inform you well as you move to the next part of the paper. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks, everyone.